Good morning. My name is Bob Orr, and I am the Dean of the School of Public Policy at the University of Maryland. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all and thank you for joining us today. Recent months have been perhaps the most difficult time for local governments around the country. In previous decades, we've had economic shocks, we've seen changes in budget realities, but nothing as secularly difficult as the current conditions and turbulence resulting from the coronavirus pandemic. Today, we are going to address the issues affecting local governments around the country. And as we see tax revenues declining for all, spending to contain the COVID-19 is increasing, and all the while, local governments must preserve the services that residents depend on. We at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy are proud to assemble this forum of experts on the economy and budgeting, as well as local government budget practitioners, to share best practices and strategies to adapt to this new fiscal world. You will hear from Professor Luke Spreen and Senior Vice President and Senior Policy Director for the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, Mark Goldwine, this morning in their session, Tea Leaves and Headwinds, COVID, Election Results, and the State of the American Economy. This afternoon, Stephen Curtis, Finance Director for the City of Omaha, Nebraska, and Robbie Sandless, Treasurer, Harford County, Maryland, will address how local governments are budgeting in the COVID era. We will continue to support local governments as they work through these difficult times, including through the Academy for Excellence in Local Governance, our partnership program with the Maryland Municipal League and the Maryland Association of Counties, and through Excel, the Elected Executive Leadership Program, the nation's premier leadership development program for elected county executives. I wish you all very rich deliberations today. The topic could not be more timely and the needs couldn't be greater. This is a time when good public policy not only matters, it is absolutely essential for the well-being of our people and our communities. I would like to thank you very much for joining us in this important conversation today. I wish you all the best today. And with that, I would like to turn the program over to Senior Associate Dean and Professor Philip Joyce.
Thank you very much, Dean Orr. And I want to join Dean Orr in welcoming you to this morning session. As Dean Orr said, we have a morning session and then an afternoon session. The afternoon session will include local government budget officials. But this morning, it's my very great pleasure to introduce this session and to introduce our two panelists. I want to remind everyone that we are recording this session, and so please keep that in mind. And also, as you listen to the various things that are going on during this session, if you have questions, you can put those questions in the chat, and we will respond to those questions after the panelists have concluded. So without further ado, I just want to introduce our new panelists, our two panelists rather. The first panelist is Luke Spreen, who is an assistant professor here at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. He's a researcher who conducts research on state and local tax policy and financial management. He's published in many different journals, including the Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory, the Journal of Public Economics, the National Tax Journal, as well as other outlets. He has received his PhD from Indiana University, and he was also previously an economist at the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics prior to his academic career. Our second panelist is Mark Goldwine. Mark Goldwine, again, is the Senior Vice President, Senior Policy Director for the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. In that role, he guides and conducts research on a wide array of topics related to fiscal policy and the federal budget. He's frequently quoted in a number of major media outlets, and he works regularly with members of Congress and their staffs on budget-related issues. He's actually worked on many of the recent efforts to try to get the federal budget under control, and those include the 2010 Fiscal Commission and the 2011 Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction. In 2011, Mark was featured in the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for law and policy, and we're very pleased that both of these gentlemen have joined us today. And I'm going to turn it over to Luke, and he's going to speak first, and then Mark will follow him, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. So thank you again for joining.
Thanks, Bill. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, hopefully there's some slides up right now. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about the state of the economy in the pandemic era. My focus is going to be primarily on economic indicators related to Maryland. There's actually a lot of new resources out there that have come out since the start of the pandemic that really track economic activity and COVID caseloads that are really useful, I think, for informing local decision making. Most of the media attention on the virus is actually focused at the national level, which I think is interesting and important, but actually misses a lot of the dynamics going on at the local level, which I think really matter for state and local officials. So hopefully in the process of talking about some of these resources, afterwards you can go visit those web pages and check out what's going on in your area. And hopefully that will inform your own decision making. So let's start with the reason why we're all here, which is the trends in COVID caseloads. So this is a 7-day moving average in new cases. So you can think of these as being the new cases on a daily basis averaged out over the last week. And the big green line that's spiking out there is actually the United States. So right now, as I think we've heard a lot about in the news, we're really in the midst of a really serious second wave right now, going into the winter. And this is true of most of the world, especially in the Northern Hemisphere. As temperatures cool off and we start to migrate indoors in the wintertime, caseloads have spiked. And so what we're seeing now is a really serious second wave that actually makes that first wave we had in the late spring, early summer actually look pretty minor by comparison. We're adding cases at about double the basis we were this time earlier in the year. I'm sorry, 6 months ago. That being said, I think if you actually look at the state level, the growth in caseloads is actually kind of all over the place. So if we look at the Midwest and the Plain States, that's really where the current wave is really the most severe. And that probably reflects temperatures in that region because we're just not seeing quite the same growth in caseloads in the South and in California and in the southern part of the West Coast. On the East Coast, we've actually have seen a not quite a severe tick up in cases. In fact, in Connecticut and Rhode Island and down in Georgia, caseloads are actually declining. So that's a good sign. So I think, again, at the national level, we're seeing a lot of attention to this big growth in caseloads. But at the more local level, it might actually not be quite as severe. That being said, 47 out of 50 states, we're seeing a tick up in cases. And we can actually look down at the county level. And so the resource I've been showing you are from the Johns Hopkins University's Coronavirus Resource Center. And so if you actually look at the county level in Maryland, we see that right now, the most severe hotspots are actually in the western part of the state. In the capital region, it's actually, by comparison, the growth in caseloads have been relatively moderate. So what I'm showing you here is new daily cases by population. And so we see that in most places in the state of Maryland, the growth has actually not been all that severe. And so I think it's important in terms of making decisions about how to respond to the virus, whether to impose some kind of county level stay-at-home order, is to really pay close attention to the trends in your specific area. So speaking of stay-at-home orders, this is another tool from Johns Hopkins. And this shows the growth in cases. You can also toggle it to daily deaths. And these green and red lines here correspond to, the red lines correspond to the addition of some new stay-at-home order at the state level. And the green lines correspond to a loosening, some kind of loosening of restrictions. And the gray dots correspond to some kind of state program related to the coronavirus. And so I particularly like this resource for tracking trends in Maryland or in any state, because it also gives me up-to-date news about how the state is responding to the virus. And so we see most recently in November 10th, Governor Hogan actually imposed new restrictions on bars and restaurants, limiting their capacity to about 50%, and also limiting indoor gatherings. And so we see, with this spike up in caseloads, we see the state responding by imposing a new stay-at-home orders. Some of these green dots also illustrate other things the state's done. So recently, Governor Hogan announced a $250 million program to support small businesses. And I think that's a really important program for reasons I'm going to show you in just a second. So while we're on the topic of stay-at-home orders, I want to talk a little bit about their effect on economic activity. So we heard a lot of discussion in the presidential election about how stay-at-home orders are really damaging economic activity and harming businesses. So this is actually from a study by Austin Goolsbee, who was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Obama, looking at visits to various types of stores in Iowa and Illinois, right on the border. So in early March, Illinois imposed a stay-at-home order. In late March, Illinois imposed a stay-at-home order that limited the ability of people to visit businesses, while Iowa didn't. And what we saw was in the months following, using cell phone data, the response of people to these stay-at-home orders was about the same. Economic activity declined by roughly an equal amount in Iowa and Illinois, slightly more in Illinois. And so what I think this tells us is that stay-at-home orders themselves aren't the root of the decline in economic activity around the coronavirus. It has a lot more to do with people's fear about getting sick. So whether or not a state imposes some kind of order, either way, in response to a growth in caseloads, either way, you're going to see a decline in economic activity. Really, the root cause of the recession that's arising from the pandemic boils down to people responding to the virus. So I don't think we should necessarily look at stay-at-home orders as being the root cause of this. I think the virus itself is the cause, and the virus is what needs to be addressed. All right, so let's actually take a look at some of these economic indicators. So this is consumer spending in Maryland, and so this 3.6% off on the right here is the change in consumer spending from January, so from the pre-pandemic period, to November 1st. And you can actually break this down on this tool, Opportunity Insights, is a group that is several professors from Stanford and Harvard that have acquired a bunch of data related to various aspects of the economy. And the thing I really like about the Opportunity Insights data is actually broken down at the state and county and metropolitan level in some cases. So you can really get very granular details about how the virus is affecting the local economy in your area. So we see spending in the state of Maryland is down by about 3.6%, but it's in some counties have seen a modest increase in consumer spending. This has really been a stark recovery from where we were in the late spring, where we were down about 30% from the pre-pandemic period. It's been really interesting to see this recovery in consumer spending because it really reflects people changing their patterns of the way they spend. So this chart is the percentage change in small business revenue from January to the end of October. And so we see here small business revenues are down about 25% relative to January as of October 31. But we actually see leisure and hospitality. And so this sector includes bars, restaurants, hotels. They're down by about 50% in the small businesses. And so we really see people shifting their spending away from eating out to restaurants and bars and shifting it towards other categories. So home improvement is really doing well right now. But the overall decline in consumer spending has actually been fairly modest. But obviously this affects small businesses disproportionately because a lot of the Main Street businesses are restaurants and bars. And we've seen that since from the pre-pandemic period to October 31, we see that in the leisure and hospitality category, about over a third of small businesses remain closed, even while many other small businesses have reopened. So that's definitely one of the hardest hit sectors in the economy in Maryland, but really everywhere. And I think this is also really problematic for a particular group of workers. So this is in Maryland. This is employment rates of people in various income categories. And so the green line is people who earn less than $27,000 a year. And the red line is individuals who earn more than $60,000 a year. So the higher earners are more likely than not going to be college graduates. They're going to be sort of like high skill workers, and then the lower wage workers are probably going to not be college graduates. And so these are the people who often find jobs in restaurants and bars in the leisure and hospitality industry. And we see that their employment rates are down by about 26% relative to January, where the higher wage workers have actually seen their employment rates tick up a little bit over this crisis. So really, the takeaways that are that I take away from this are restaurants, bars, they've been hit really hard by this, especially the smaller business restaurants and bars, the locally owned ones, and then the people they employ. And low wage workers generally are really bearing the brunt of this downturn. And we haven't really seen a big recovery in job postings since in the last few months, even despite this improvement in economic activity. So job postings in Maryland remain down about 20% relative to the pre-recession, to the pre-pandemic levels. That being said, in some states, there are more job openings. So we see over here on the left in Connecticut, that's green, that's a good sign. That means the job postings are actually up just a little bit. But again, you can go visit Opportunity Insights Economic Tracker and see how things are faring in your backyard. So I think we have some reasons to be concerned about what's going to happen in this current second wave, and also how the federal government's responding to the virus. And so this is a figure from a study prepared by the JP Morgan Chase Institute. And it's looking at the checking account balance of people who were employed and unemployed, in the months after the first wave of the virus. So some of you might remember Congress passed the CARES Act in March, which provided a variety of benefits to unemployed workers. One of the benefits it provided was a $600 top-off to all unemployed workers' benefits, effectively supplementing above and beyond the regular UI replacement rate for wages. And what unemployed individuals were able to do during this period is actually build up a pretty healthy checking account balance. But then that $600 weekly supplement actually expired in July. And that reserve they were building up actually began to disappear, began to be drawn down. Now, unfortunately, this study ends in August, but what it tells me is that much of the reserve that people were able to build up earlier in the year is probably by this point depleted. And I think we have some reason to be concerned because there's about 13 million individuals right now that are on extended pandemic unemployment assistance, that basically the only eligibility requirement for that is that they lost their job as a result of the pandemic. Now, that was passed under the CARES Act, and it's going to end on December 31. So unless it's extended by Congress, there's going to be about 13 to 14 million people who are going to lose their unemployment benefits at the end of the year. So this is going to have a really serious spillover effect on state and local governments, because states may need to step in and provide supplemental benefits in place of the federal government. And it's also going to strain social services. So I think that's sort of one of the things I'm most concerned about that's on the horizon, is the end of this pandemic unemployment assistance program, where a lot of people who are financially dependent on unemployment insurance right now are going to lose their benefits. So let's take all of this sort of information about the economy, and let's take a look at the revenue implications of it. So these are figures I prepared using data from the state of Maryland's Bureau of Revenue Estimates. And on the left is the change in state income tax revenues and retail sales tax revenues from the original March forecast to the September forecast. So you can think of the March forecast as being the pre-pandemic forecast. It's basically before the state realized the virus was coming and it was going to be severe, they prepared a set of forecasts. And then they subsequently updated them in May. And that's what these charts on the right, on the two bars on the right are showing. And then in September, the state prepared a new forecast based on everything we learned over the summer. So what the March to September forecast tells us is that relative to where we thought we were headed in pre-pandemic times, income tax revenues are going to be down. The state expects income tax revenues to be down about 2% for fiscal year 2021, which runs from July 1, 2020 to June 30, 2021. Retail sales tax revenues are expected to be down about 8%. So that being said, even though tax revenues are expected to be down in this fiscal year, they're actually going to be much better than was originally anticipated in May, when we were sort of in the depth of the crisis. So the most up-to-date forecasts are actually up about 10% for the individual income tax and up about 5% for the retail sales tax. So the depth of the downturn, its effect on state revenues is actually not nearly as bad as it was expected to be back in May, which I think is really encouraging and reflects the fact that we've seen stronger consumer spending than we otherwise expected, and also better job growth, particularly among higher earners, has really protected income tax revenues. That being said, retail sales taxes are expected to be down about 8% from where we were in the pre-pandemic period. I'm actually going to zoom out a little bit now and look at total U.S. state and local government employment, and this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but you can also look it up in your local area. And so we've actually seen a rebound in hiring among state and local employees. So on the far left here is March 20. So that's about when we started this pandemic downturn. And we can see here state and local governments started shedding jobs over this period, but have actually been adding workers since about August. And we're actually only down about 3.5% from where we were at the start of recession. So what this tells me is that state and local governments too are also starting to feel a little bit more optimistic about where they are from a fiscal perspective. On the other hand, public education, so public schools, have actually seen pretty serious deterioration in employment. And we haven't really seen a rebound in this current school year, which I don't think should be too surprising, because so much of education is taking place remotely right now that they just simply don't need the staff that they would need if schools were fully open and we were doing in-person education. So turning to the future of where we're going in Maryland. What these three charts are showing us is growth in revenues from the previous fiscal year. So the fiscal year 20 revenues, this is growth from fiscal year 2019 to fiscal year 20. And as a reminder, since Maryland's fiscal year cuts from July 1 to June 30, the fiscal year 20 revenues reflect about 3 months of the pandemic from April, June, and July. And then, I'm sorry, from March, April, May, and June. And then fiscal year 21 is going to reflect basically all the pandemic because it started on July 1, 2020. And then fiscal year 22 is sort of after we get past the pandemic, because it's looking like we're going to have a vaccine by about April or May based on what we've seen. So income tax revenues actually increased by about 4% in fiscal year 20, and retail sales tax revenues were only down by about 3.7%. So overall, that's a good thing. It's looking like income tax revenues are doing much better from this method. There's actually expected to be some growth in income tax revenues from fiscal year 20 to fiscal year 2021, which is what's in the middle here, and only a very modest decrease in sales taxes from the previous year. And then finally, in fiscal year 22, based on the September estimates, it's looking like the state's expecting about a 4% increase in income taxes from fiscal year 21 and a 7% rebound in retail sales taxes. So this is really good news for Maryland local governments. Besides the property tax, Maryland local governments receive a lot of their revenue from income taxes. And so I think the fact that we're seeing income tax revenues holding up, at least in Maryland, is a really good sign that the budgetary impact of COVID might not be quite as serious as was originally anticipated. On the other hand, if you're in a state or a local government that levies a local option sales tax, I think things are going to be a little bit more problematic, especially in the current fiscal year, because consumer spending just hasn't caught up, and we're probably going to start to see some deterioration going into the winter. As more and more, as the pandemic takes off and we're seeing more stay-at-home orders. All right, so about 40% of local government revenues come from property taxes. So I think it's important to take a look at trends in the housing market, which sort of informs what we can expect to happen to property tax revenues. So I'm sure you remember the Great Recession. A big component of the Great Recession was the housing bubble and the collapse of the subprime mortgage market. What happened as a result of that was a wave of delinquencies and foreclosures, which resulted in people losing their houses. And there wasn't the demand for housing that there was a few years prior in the Great Recession. And so what ended up happening was we had an imbalance between demand for housing and supply for housing. The supply exceeded the demand and home prices fell. That has not been the case in this current downturn. The Federal Reserve has been so aggressive about cutting interest rates that we now have historically low mortgage interest rates, and we're really seeing an influx of new buyers into the housing market, and that's had the effect of driving up sales and driving up home prices. In fact, I did a little research on this, and about right now the average time on the market of a home is about 50 days nationally, and that's actually down about 20% from a year ago. So if anything, the housing market is stronger than it was a year ago. And Zillow is forecasting basically growth of around 7% in the Washington, D.C. metro area. And Zillow has some really fantastic tools for studying housing markets. You can actually search down to the zip code or the neighborhood level to see price growth in your area. They also have data on average rental costs if you're interested in learning more about that. And so they're forecasting about a 6% growth in home prices in Washington, D.C., and closer to 7% in the D.C. suburbs. And so that's really rapid price growth, faster than what we saw going into the pandemic, because so many people are flooding into the housing market right now. Even in rural areas are seeing pretty healthy growth in prices. And again, you can check out and see what's going on in your area using Zillow's tools. So I think the biggest concern we have right now about the housing market and how it could spill over in property taxes is the mortgage delinquencies. So right now, about 6.7% of homeowners who have a mortgage are delinquent on their mortgage. These data are from a group called Black Knight, and they have this mortgage monitor that they publish every month. And so this is from their September report, and all these data are free and available to you if you visit their webpage. So we're at about 6.7% delinquency rate. During the peak of the Great Recession, we were over 10%. So by comparison, the delinquency rate is pretty bad relative to normal times, but nowhere near where we were in the Great Recession. Most of these delinquencies are over 90 days. They're actually even longer than that. Most of these delinquencies basically correspond to homeowners who are on some kind of forbearance plan. So under the CARES Act, homeowners were permitted to request a 180-day forbearance from their mortgage lender if they were unable to make payments due to the pandemic. And so eligibility into the forbearance programs was fairly open. And so at the peak of the pandemic back in May, at the peak of this program, there are about 8 million homeowners on some kind of forbearance program who were again able to delay payments for 180 days. And we've seen that number deteriorate. We're now at around 5 million. After that initial 180-day period ends, those homeowners in the forbearance program can actually request a 180-day extension. So if you imagine that most of these homeowners came into the program in April or May of 2020, these forbearance program, and they received this extension, this forbearance program is going to expire for most homeowners in April or May of 2021. So depending on how quickly the economy recovers, we may still have a substantial number of homeowners in forbearance in this period, and then that program ends, and now they're responsible for making their mortgage payments that they've been delaying. So I think a concern is that if Congress fails to extend this program, we may have a glut of homeowners who are going to enter foreclosure around that time. And so it may be necessary for Congress to think about extending this program for another 6 months until the vaccine is in widespread distribution and these homeowners can find jobs and get back to work. So I think that's sort of something to be troubled about. Another thing I'll note is I couldn't find any information on property tax delinquencies. There just wasn't anything out there right now, but I did find a report by Fitch, which is a credit rating agency, and they basically think that there's not going to be a significant decline in property tax revenues in the upcoming fiscal year in the current fiscal year for local governments. That being said, it might be worthwhile to take a look at your own property tax information and check on delinquencies. Make sure that you don't have a large block of delinquent homeowners who are in forbearance or delinquent on their own property taxes, because I think one of the worst things that could happen right now is that a lot of people who are out of work as a result of the pandemic lose their house on top of everything else. So that's something to look out for. One nice thing about Black Knight's Mortgage Monitor is that you can also see delinquencies in your own state. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the pandemic economy is sort of uneven across the country. And the way you can interpret this table is del percent is percent delinquent, NC is non-current. So these are people who are behind on their mortgage, and then FC is percent in foreclosure. And so we see the percentage that are non-current is about 8.7% in Maryland. That's about a 74% increase from last year. But in other places, in other states like Hawaii, for example, they have about 9.2% non-current, and that's about 143% increase from last year. So there is a lot of stress in the mortgage market. I think the good news, though, is that it's not the same sort of situation we were in the Great Recession. Right now, demand is outpacing supply of housing. And so even if there's a subset of people who are in foreclosure, who will lose their house, which would be unfortunate, the good news is a new buyer is going to come in, and that's not going to result in a significant decline in the market value of houses, which also means there's not going to be a significant decline in valuations of houses from a property tax perspective. All right, so just to summarize, in the process of putting this presentation together, I was actually sort of surprised with how much better the economy is faring in Maryland, but also generally nationally over the summer and the fall. I'm concerned about the pandemic going forward. We're in a really serious second wave right now. It's hitting parts of the country harder, especially the Midwest and the Great Plains states, harder than it is in the East Coast and the West Coast. But I think we have reason to believe that it's going to pick up everywhere as temperatures go down everywhere. I think the good news on the horizon is that, as we heard last week, there's a vaccine out there. It's highly effective, 95% for the Moderna vaccine, 90% for Pfizer. Based on what I've read, they have enough vaccine right now to vaccinate about 35 million people by the end of the year. So obviously that's going to go to first responders first, and immunocompromised people who are at the highest risk. Based on what I saw from Anthony Fauci, he was quoted as saying they expect to have a vaccine in widespread distribution by April 2021. So optimistically, I think we're going to be back to some semblance of normal by April 2021 and through the end of 2021. But there's uncertainty around that. Things happen. The vaccine might be delayed for reasons that we can't foresee right now. In the meantime, I think it's going to be a pretty tough winter. And whether or not states impose stay-at-home orders, economic activity is probably going to contract again. And I think this really sets up the question of, is the federal government going to come in and provide some more aid to state and local governments, and also extend unemployment benefits to those affected by the pandemic? So hopefully Mark can give us some insight about that. So I'm going to turn it over to him now.
Well, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for having me here. I'm going to apologize in advance. Every single time I share my PowerPoint screen, there's always this like a very slow start to it. So I expect that to happen as well. Here. Okay. Oh, there wasn't. It's a miracle. Can everyone see my full screen? Great. Um, well, I'm very excited to be joining you all virtually today. Hope maybe this time next year it'll be in person. I'm not as optimistic that'll be by April, but I do think by, there's a lot of positive news that by August things may be pretty normal. Let me kind of start with where we are, then where we're headed, mainly from a COVID relief standpoint, but also from what that means for the federal debt. I think we all know that early on, especially this pandemic was really economically devastating. Between the first and second quarters of this year, meaning take January, February, March, which was mostly pre-pandemic, except for that end of March in the United States, compared to April, May, June, which was, the lockdown period. We were all in our homes, so the retail shops were shut down. So from kind of mostly pre-pandemic to the worst part, the economy shrank by about 10%, our economic output. Now, in one sense, that's pretty remarkable testament to the resilience of our economy. The fact that, we all remember that period. We weren't leaving our homes in many cases. Most businesses were, many businesses were shut down. The fact that during that period, we were still producing 90% as much as in normal times is pretty unbelievable. At the same time, never in US history has the economy, that is very devastating, fallen that fast. Even during the Great Depression, where we did have a more than 10% decline in the economy, it didn't happen at that speed. We've really never quarter to quarter lost 10% of our economy. It was potentially devastating. And while we've recovered a bit more than half of what we lost, we're still well below where we otherwise would have been. And although we don't have today's data, very likely still pretty far below where we were pre-pandemic. So this was economically devastated. We've regained some of what we lost, but we still have a far way to go. That's clear if you look at economic output. It's clear if you look at a variety of other measures, but especially jobs. From peak to trough, from February to April, we lost about 22 million jobs. This doesn't count people that had their hours cut substantially or, are working small businesses and not making any income, but people that totally lost their jobs, 22 million. Again, we've gained about half of that back, but we're still down, depending on how you measure, 10, 12 million jobs. That's pretty substantial. That puts us basically, in the recovery period, we're now where we were at the worst point of the Great Recession or close to it in terms of jobs lost. But the federal government responded incredibly aggressively. This is something my organization has been tracking through our website, covidmoneytracker.org, which I'll try to promote as many times as I can over the course of this talk. But every branch of federal government responded very quickly to this economic disaster. Administrative actions, legislative actions, Federal Reserve actions. This particular graph shows what's the total amount of money that they sort of allowed to be spent or allowed to be loaned or allowed to be tax deferred. In the case of administrative actions, it's over $500 billion, over $4 trillion for legislative, over $7 trillion for Federal Reserve. And then this more solid line is how much has actually gone out the door, which if you add it together is over $5 trillion. In terms of legislative measures alone, through the CARES Act, through the Families First Act, through the Paycheck Protection Extension Act, and other smaller bills, policymakers allocated over $4 trillion. And not all this is, when I say allocated, I'm not saying that they're on net going to spend 4.1 trillion. But if you count everything they've offered to loan out, everything they're going to spend, all the tax breaks, all the tax deferrals, it adds up to over 4 trillion. The largest share of that was what we're calling loan programs, 1.6 trillion loan programs, including 670 billion allocated to the Paycheck Protection Program, which is a loan program, but not really a loan. The way this worked, for folks that don't know, is small businesses could, and medium-sized businesses actually, could go to a bank and say, I want a forgivable loan equal to 10 weeks worth of payroll. And the bank would give them the loan. And so long as you meet some basic criteria of ultimately hiring back all your workers or most of your workers, and use the money for things like payroll and rent, you could get the money forgiven. And so for most businesses, the vast majority, this is really a grant. and there might be some left over that they pay back with a small 1% interest rate. But this was mostly basically a cash infusion of small businesses. On top of that, we had more traditional loans to small businesses, something called the economic injury disaster loans. This was part of the SBA. It's sort of a favorable loan that a lot of small businesses took up. We supported the Federal Reserve to issue its own loans, which I'll get into in a minute. And we had smaller loans to airline companies and related things in that industry. In addition, we had a lot of tax policy to support the economy. This was mostly not tax breaks, it was mostly tax deferrals. We gave employers the option, in most cases, of not paying their share of the payroll tax in 2020 and instead paying it in 2021 and 2022. We also let them spread their losses and other things over time. We had over $500 billion towards income support, the largest share towards unemployment benefits. Luke mentioned actually all of those, a $600 per week bonus through the end of July. Now, if you kind of do the math on that, that means that people are getting the equivalent of $31,000 a year on top of their existing unemployment benefits, which meant that the vast majority, more than 2/3, probably close to 3/4 of people, were actually making more in unemployment than they were making in their wages, as it turned out. Almost 50% more on average, 40 to 50% more. We also expanded unemployment to gig workers and self-employed and increased the number of weeks by basically an additional 3 months of unemployment. There was direct payments to households. We sent most people a $1,200 direct deposit. I was going to say check, but actually only like 200 people got checks. Almost everyone got a bank deposit. There was some money for state and local funding, both through the Coronavirus Relief Fund that gave states money for COVID-specific expenses, and more general funding through higher Medicaid match, more money for K-12 education and transit. We increased health spending, including aid and help to support hospitals, but also money for testing and for vaccine development, and for Operation Warp Speed, which is what's helped to yield these 2 vaccines that are both 90% plus effective, we think, and spending in a variety of other areas as well. So there's a lot of money, $4.1 trillion out the door. Now, of that, it's going to cost the government about $2.7 trillion, we think. The reason it's going to cost so much less is some of this is loans that's going to be paid back. Some of this is tax deferrals that will ultimately have to be paid later or have been paid later. And some of it's money that just isn't going to end up being spent. For example, small businesses only ended up using about $540 billion of that Paycheck Protection Program out of the 670 that was available. So on net, the federal government's likely to spend, is projected to spend about $2.7 trillion through Congress to combat the recession. And this is a lot of money. The numbers differ in this slide because I'm looking only over a 5-year period, but 2.5 you can see is pretty close to 2.7. As a share of the economy, we will have spent, if we do nothing else, about as much to fight the COVID pandemic as we did to fight the Great Recession. You do everything to fight the Great Recession, from the those initial checks under the Bush administration, to the big stimulus bill, to the TARP program that gave the bank bailout, and the housing takeover, to the payroll tax holiday. Add all that up at about the same as the COVID relief. Here's the difference. That Great Recession money was spent over a 6-year period. And if you look at this, you can see, very little in the first year, a lot in the second year, but really it was kind of very spread out evenly over that 6-year period. The COVID money on net is mostly spent in the first 6 months. So we basically we spent as much in the first 6 months, which is now past, of the current economic crisis, as we spent over 6 years of the Great Recession. It is a much sharper increase in spending. It's a very aggressive response. And Congress didn't act alone. The Federal Reserve also basically announced at the beginning, we will do whatever we can, whatever it takes to stabilize the economy. So what does that mean? They cut interest rates to 0 pretty much immediately. They got rid of the reserve requirements on banks, so banks could basically lend out as much as they wanted and were willing. They brought back all the old facilities from the Great Recession to make sure there was liquidity in various markets, to make sure that there was no financial crisis by propping up banks. They didn't have to use them very much. They bought about $2.5 trillion of assets, including $2 trillion of federal debt. So the federal government could go and pass all this stimulus without having to worry about going to the markets really to find debt buyers. And they created, with help of Treasury, a bunch of new facilities. They created a facility that could be as much as $750 billion to buy corporate bonds and bond funds. as much as $500 billion to buy paycheck protection loans, another $500 billion, I apologize, this is blurry, for possible state and local loans, municipal lending facility to buy their bonds, and the Main Street lending facility, which for the first time got the Federal Reserve in the business of actually supporting small business loans. They're not directly doing the loans, they're buying the loans from banks, but effectively they are supporting, banks put in like 5%. The Federal Reserve is really indirectly making loans to small businesses. Now, while these facilities are really big, 750, 600 billion, 500 billion, the Federal Reserve is barely using them. Of that corporate credit facility, the 750 by corporate bonds, they've only bought about 14 billion of corporate bonds. The municipal lending facility that was going to spend as much as $500 billion for state and municipal debt, they've actually only bought 2 bonds to support the state of Illinois and to support the New York's MTA, Metropolitan Transit Authority. Only less than $2 billion. Even the Main Street lending facility has still only bought less than 5 billion of debt. So while the Federal Reserve made big promises to do whatever it takes, their interpretation of what it takes hasn't involved anything close to the size of these facilities. It's been small loans, and I think if you ask some people, the goal of these loans is really not even the loans themselves, but just to give the Fed credibility that they're willing to do more. The idea here is have big guns, but don't fire very many bullets. And that in itself can help to stabilize the market. You can see here, they hugely expanded their balance sheet quicker than they ever have before. I'm going to go a little quickly because it's a long presentation. But I'll end that. In addition to the legislative actions and the Federal Reserve actions, the administration acted unilaterally in a lot of cases. Many of us that owed taxes on April 15th may remember we didn't have to pay them until July 15th. They delayed tax day, which gave some liquidity to the market. They changed the rules in Medicare to essentially allow to basically pay hospitals and other providers in advance, so that during that period that hospitals were basically kind of not taking any discretionary appointments, they could get some of their Medicare money and kind of owe it later. When that $600 unemployment bonus ended, the administration temporarily created a new $300 bonus that lasted for 5 to 6 weeks. That really, I think, was a bridge for many people between that, between getting paid way more than you were before you were employed to actually getting paid about what you were when you were employed, to now only getting paid about 50% of what you were when you were employed. But that bridge probably made a big difference because it happened over a period that a lot of people were moving back into employment. No one's paying, essentially no one. I know we're being a big debate over canceling student loan debt. Almost no one is actually paying their student loan right now because the administration put most of them into deferral and is canceling the interest. And they did a bunch of other smaller things as well. Now you can see all of this and dive down. You can see from like the highest level of detail, diving down to seeing how much Moderna got for their research and development, or how much Joe's Pizza got at Main Street lending facilities by going to covidmoneytracker.org. If I took you there right now, it'd probably freeze the whole Zoom, so I'm not going to try that, but definitely go check it out. We really have tried to catalog everything that's happening, and not only what was promised, but how much is out the door in each of these areas. So you can see it over time, how much money is actually going out and how much is starting to come back in some cases. You can kind of search, just to give you a couple of examples. You could search by area. So by our estimates, there's about 280 billion spent on state and local aid. This includes the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which I mentioned is specific for COVID-related expenses that states might have. It includes higher Medicaid match, which essentially is general revenue for the states because it allows them to be able to spend that money elsewhere. And similarly, money for transit and education. There's different ways you could measure state and local aid, but again, we think there's about 280 billion that's been committed. Not all of that is out the door yet. I think something like 200 is out the door. If you want to look at education in particular, you can see that K through 12 schools through state and local funding got about 16 billion. Private schools and charter schools and other education companies through the Paycheck Protection Program got 12 billion. And colleges through grants, various grants, got about 14 billion. Overall, public schools got more than private schools, but they have way more students on a per pupil basis. Private schools actually have done much better in both private colleges and private K through 12 schools in the first few rounds of COVID relief than public schools have. Now, what does this all mean, right? So they spent a lot of money. Did it work? I think is a big question. The short answer is yes. Yes, it actually appeared to work quite well overall, especially over that lockdown period, over that 3 months in April, May, and June. Between the first quarter and the second quarter, so from when the economy was mostly normal to when it was at its worst, market income fell by about 8%. That's pretty consistent with a 10% fall in overall economic activity. It makes sense, right? But when you add in existing government transfers, the expanded unemployment benefits, the recovery rebates, the Paycheck Protection Program, and other COVID relief, disposable income actually rose 10% quarter over quarter. 10% is unbelievable. In a typical quarter, disposable income rises by 1%. Okay, so in a normal, healthy growing economy, income grows 1%. During this period, when the economy shrank by 10%, income grew 10%. That is unbelievable. And even if I were to project this out to the third quarter, when we didn't have the advantage of all the rebates, income was still up about 5% relative to pre-COVID. So if the question is, did we protect income on average? The answer is yes, and then some. We actually, this I think is unheard of, certainly in this country, and I think anywhere in the world, of income rising this much during a period the economy was shrinking this much. So we certainly protected and actually enhanced income to the point that people have a lot of savings that actually help them get through quarter 3 and are going to help them through quarter 4 in many cases. There's also a big difference for small businesses. Small businesses, I think, are starting to struggle again now, especially with winter coming. But during that period that they were basically all shut down, and then having to open very gradually, if at all, this relief kept a lot of them in business. I mean, there were a lot of businesses that started with not enough cash on hand to make it through the period. And thanks to PPP, they had enough money to bridge through, adapting to what's going to be a new medium-term normal. For restaurants, that meant outdoor dining, more delivery services, et cetera, and fewer employees. I'm not going to pretend that all small businesses are thriving. There are some that are actually doing quite well, but this cash kept most of them in survival through the worst parts of this. The Fed actions, just by announcing they were going to buy these bonds, actually stabilized the bond markets. Buying the bonds helped too, but it was really just the announcement effect. Once yields were really starting to spike, and then the Fed said we're going to step in, and the market calmed down, and people kind of knew, okay, there's a backup, there's a lender of last resort, and that made a huge difference. States and localities got a lot of aid. They need a lot more, but thanks to the money that was issued directly through the CARES Act in the ways I mentioned, but also indirectly. Remember, unemployment benefits are taxable as income in most states. Remember, when people have a 10% boost in income, they're going to spend more, and therefore sales tax revenue is going to go up. And remember, when the economy is stronger, revenue is stronger. So both thanks to the direct aid and the indirect aid that went through the states, basically every state was fine through fiscal year 2020. And with rainy day funds, a number of states will be okay through 2021. A number of states won't, and 2022 is going to look pretty dismal as well. So states and localities definitely have some serious issues currently and on the horizon, but the relief made a big difference. It got them through 2020, and for some states through 2021, which is where fiscal year 2021 ends in the summertime, remember? And we potentially prevented a depression. I think there was a real risk early in this crisis that what started as shutdown orders would be businesses laying off all their workers, would be people not being able to pay their mortgages, would be houses going under, would be further layoffs, would be a financial crisis, and possibly a depression on top of the coronavirus. That didn't happen. The economy contracted 10% rather than the projected 15, and now it's recovered to only, I mean, it's still bad, but we're only down 3 or 4%. We prevented a spiraling depression. I don't want to pretend everything is great, everything is normal, but we did not go into a depression. And I think that you have to credit the Federal Reserve and executive and legislative actions for a lot of that. And also, I think, surprising overall resilience and adaptability of the US economy, which I'll confess I underestimated, and I think others did as well. But again, things are not all peachy. Most of the federal aid has ended. What hasn't is mostly going to end December 31st. Joblessness still remains very high. A lot of small businesses that found a way to make it through the summer and fall aren't going to fare so well through the winter. States and localities, I think, are reconsidering more layoffs and furloughs. The virus is spiking like we've never seen it before. And with winter coming, I'm very, very scared. Phil, are you coming on because I have to close out, or do I still have a few more minutes? Okay. I just saw your video pop up and I assumed I was getting my cue card, or my buzzer. On top of all this, the debt is out of control. We ran a deficit of, well, let me just say, we came into this running $1 trillion deficits, and that really made no sense. If you kind of, believe, I think, unless you believe in modern monetary theory, almost any economic theory says that when the economy is strong, that's the time you do deficit reduction. So the 5 years before this pandemic, when unemployment was at 3.5%, that would have been a good time to deal with the long-term unsustainability of and insolvency of Social Security and Medicare and our lack of revenue. Instead, what do? We cut taxes, we increase spending again, and we cut taxes again. And one of these bills was completely partisan. All the others, one of the tax cuts, all the others were very bipartisan. So there was a lot of interest in increasing the debt, to the point that we came into this with $1 trillion deficits, which was really, I think, unacceptable and a huge failure. Now in 2020, the deficit tripled to $3 trillion. That was totally justified. The whole reason you keep your debt under control in good times is so you can borrow when you need to. And really the two reasons to borrow are if the economy is weak and needs the federal government to boost it, or if you have kind of a once in a rare crisis that you want to space the cost out over time. We had both of those things, right? And so the borrowing in 2020 and 2021 is totally sensible. It's exactly what we should be doing. But if you look at this path, we're projected to keep borrowing long after the crisis has passed. Thanks to irresponsibility coming into this crisis, layered on top of the crisis, debt is now larger than the economy for the only time in our history since World War II. Only once in our history has debt ever exceeded the size of the economy. And after World War II, we've basically balanced budgets and had a plan to pay down our debt to GDP. Right now, our debt is just projected to continue to rise. Under current law, debt's going to be double the size of the economy by 2050, which is unprecedented. If we kind of keep doing what we normally do, debt's going to be 250% of GDP, which would put us at Japan levels. Japan being the only country out there in the developed world that has had debt that high and hasn't had some kind of crisis or correction. But by the way, they haven't had economic growth in 30 years, so I'm not sure we really want to be Japan. We're headed for an unsustainable debt trajectory. During the election, the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget estimated the Biden and Trump plans. Since Biden is the president-elect, I've removed Trump from this graph just to show you if he were to enact everything proposed in the campaign, even with all the deficit-reducing tax increases, our best case estimate, is that he would increase debt by an additional $5 trillion, up to 127% of GDP instead of 109 by 2030. It could be better, if you kind of believe all their numbers and you give the benefit of the doubt and everything. It could be much worse. In no case is debt going to be under control under their agenda. Meanwhile, even under current law, all our major trust funds are at risk. The highway and Medicare trust funds are projected to run out this coming presidential term. The disability and old age Social Security trust funds, not long after that. We always talk about, we got to save Social Security to help your grandkids, save your kid. I got a 3-year-old, I got to save Social Security for her. That's really the wrong way of thinking about it. 2031 is 11 years from now. It means that somebody retiring today at age 62 will be 73 years old. We got to save Social Security for your grandparents, folks. Social Security only has a few years left. And if the trust fund runs out, the law says all benefits got to be cut 25% across the board, unless we do something to change it. So we got to address that. But here's the good news. There's a lot of areas where I think the parties could come together. We're either going to have divided governments going forward, or in the best case, it's going to be a 50-50 Senate with Harris having to cast the tie-breaking vote and some more moderate Democrats. So the Biden agenda from the campaign is not what's going to happen. But there is room for the parties to work together. They can work together to support the economic recovery. I'll talk more, but there's bills out there from both parties. They're kind of having petty disagreements over the size, in my opinion, but there's actually a lot of overlap. We can work together in lowering healthcare costs. Everybody agrees healthcare costs are too high, and there are policies that can lower drug spending, lower how much Medicare is paying for providers. For example, paying hospitals and doctors the same amount different amounts for the same services. ban surprise billing. There are ways we can lower healthcare costs that will save money for the federal government and for patients and for employers and for states and localities. We can improve tax enforcement. The parties disagree on whether taxes should be higher or lower, but they should all agree people should pay the taxes they owe. And so by giving the IRS more authority, more funding, and closing some egregious loopholes, we can get more money without actually having to raise anyone's taxes. That's a place to start. We can fix the budget process, which is in many ways broken. I can talk more about that in Q&A. And we got all these trust funds to deal with. Maybe we can't come to agreement on common sense things like raising the gas tax or adjusting the retirement age or increasing the tax max. But Senators Romney and Manchin have a bipartisan bill with, I think something like 40 co-sponsors in the House and Senate in both parties that would create new rescue committees where at least Republicans never has to come together to talk about how to save the Highway Trust Fund, how to save Social Security. So if we can't actually agree to solve the problem, maybe we can agree to talk about solving the problems. Just to kind of give you some sense, here's the kinds of policies we could do to rescue the economy and their bang for buck. Basically, for every dollar we spend on recovery rebates, will boost GDP by about 60 cents, as an example. And here's some examples of health and tax policies with bipartisan support. But at that point, that's my spiel. I hope I ended on an optimistic note, even though usually I'm the pessimist in the room.
Thank you very much, Mark. Really appreciate it. Those were two great presentations, lots of stuff there. Lots of things for people perhaps to ask questions about. And so we have some questions in the chat. So one goes back to, I think, Luke's discussion of the property tax. And so the question is, I think, this is from Laura Allen, what's the relationship between what we're talking about in terms of prices and assessed valuations? Because assessed valuations don't necessarily always directly follow prices. So if I'm a local government, how should I think about that?
Yeah, so there's obviously a lag between what's happening in market values and assessed valuations. So just using Maryland as an example, Maryland's actually a little bit unusual because the state assesses properties rather than the counties, which is sort of common. But essentially what happens is their assessment strategy, Maryland's assessment strategy, is based on whatever's going on with market prices around the house being assessed. So if market prices are rising in an area, we're going to see that pan out in assessments, but it's going to take some time to pan out. This is part of the reason why the property tax is such a strong tax in the face of economic headwinds, is because assessments typically take a while to catch up with whatever's going on in market prices. So I think what we're going to see is local governments, depending on when the assessments take place. So if the county does them every year, there won't be much of a lag. But if it's like Maryland, where it's only happening every 3 years, there might be a lag between when those assessments catch up with market values. But generally, it's a good thing for local governments that the market values are rising.
Thank you. So this is also, I think, mostly for Luke, but please feel free, Mark, if you have anything to add on either of these. And please, I have additional questions I can ask, but I'd much rather ask your questions. So please put questions in the chat if there are other questions that you have. This is from Dimitri. For smaller municipalities whose income tax revenue, which is a major source of revenue, is dependent on higher wage earners with non-W-2 revenue, will they not really be affected by the pandemic?
I'll take a opening stab at this, and then maybe Mark can offer some insight. So I think some things to think about in terms of income tax revenue go back to a lot of what Mark was talking about. So incomes have grown in this crisis as a result of the generosity of federal programs, and UI benefits are taxable. So all of these low wage workers who are out of work are still paying or are expected to pay taxes on the UI benefits they receive to both the federal government and the state government. It's possible some states exempt UI benefits, but I know they don't in Maryland. I think the hardest thing to to sort of guess is what's going on with non-W2 income. So the stock market's booming. So that's probably pretty good for high net worth individuals who, if they're able to realize any of these capital gains, are going to be paying income taxes on those capital gains. Individuals who have a lot of their money tied up in businesses and business income, particularly if they're in sectors that we talked about in my presentation, hotels, bars, restaurants, they might see their incomes decrease quite a bit as their businesses are essentially not nearly as profitable as they've been in previous years. So I can't really offer a ton of certainty about what's going on with non-W2 income, but I think I am confident in saying that among high wage W2 workers, their income seems to have held up. And then because of all these federal actions, low income workers are still paying a fair amount of income tax into the system at both the state and federal level.
Mark, anything to add?
I mean, I don't have much to add other than for a lot of business income, even businesses that I think are doing okay cash flow right now, a lot of owners are not taking money out because they're terrified of what's going to happen. So that combined with some of the changes in tax rules, and I think that states and localities are riding on them, I do think means that that a lot of the small business income, it's going to be a rough year. But these other areas are seeing a boost. And if there is some big federal aid package that includes retroactive unemployment, you'll see a further big boost, kind of retroactive to 2020 potentially.
I wanted to sort of jump in and ask both of you, you both sort of alluded to the prospect for more federal aid. And in Luke's presentation, he was presenting a somewhat rosier picture for state revenues in particular than what one might see. And I wonder what the implications of that are in your view for the size of an additional federal aid package that might be forthcoming. There was a lot of discussion before the election on the fact that state and local governments needed more money. And so I guess there's two questions there. The first is, do they need more money? And the second is, how would one think about the magnitude of assistance that would be necessary for state and local governments in order to get us through to a return to something that looks a little bit more like normal?
You want me to go first? You want to go first?
Please go
All
first,
right.
Mark.
I mean, I'll speak generally, then you can speak specifically. But the idea that states and localities needed $1.1 trillion or $1.2 trillion, which was in the initial HEROES Act, I think was never really the case. And even in the most pessimistic scenario, and states and localities have turned out to do much better than the most pessimistic scenario. In part because I think there was actually a lot more federal aid than what they realized, both direct and indirect. And in part because the economy has been much stronger, and for better or for worse, the weakness in the economy has mostly been concentrated among lower income who contribute less to tax revenue. So I think that 1.2 trillion or 1.1 trillion never made sense, and especially doesn't make sense now. But I think what we saw in the last recession is if you let states and localities suffer with their balanced budget requirements, they're going to respond with layoffs, with furloughs, with tax increases, and with things that I think will undermine efforts for the economic recovery in the private sector. And so states and localities, I think, certainly do need more cash infusion. My preference is to do it with something like the higher Medicaid match, where you can actually tag it to the employment situation within the states, and so we don't have to keep guessing. We can tag it more. But I also think that looking at more money for schools has a lot of bipartisan support. And look, a lot of this is just the politics of it. Money's pretty fungible, but if Republicans are more willing to give money for K through 12 than they are for general state money, or general local money, I think it's worth looking at. But in terms of the number, I think we're talking about something in the $200 to $300 billion range.
The only thing I'll add to that is Congress needs to extend or think about the pandemic unemployment assistance program, because 13 to 14 million people getting thrown off of unemployment insurance as a result of that program lasting on December 31 is going to spill over really hard on state governments that depend on income tax revenue that they're raising off UI benefits. And not only that, it's going to burden social insurance systems at the state level. Social spending is going to have to increase. Local governments are probably going to have to pick up the slack because there's a good chance those people are going to need money to eat. The local governments might have to start beefing up soup kitchens. So I mean that's if Congress does nothing else, that's a big one. And then the other one is thinking about how much longer to extend the forbearance program, so we're not throwing people out of their houses. And Mark, it looks like you want to add something, so please jump in.
Yeah, no, I mean, I want to agree with you. My view is they should agree to an aid package. It just didn't need to be the $3 trillion, HEROES Act, but it should be something. But if policymakers cannot agree to an overall aid package by the end of the year, there is a continuing resolution that has to be passed on December 11th that will have to include basic funding for government. There'll be a finite set of things they can put on that, but I think that my number 1, 2, and 3 priorities would be extend the PUA, the pandemic unemployment, at least for the length of the CR, extend that additional 13 weeks of unemployment, and make sure states have the money for vaccine distribution and testing, which is really important. If we want to end this pandemic, it's not enough to invent a vaccine. We actually have to get the vaccine to people.
One quick follow-up to that, there's a tendency sometimes for the Congress when it's passing legislation to not actually target it very well and to sort of spread it very widely. Since this pandemic is something that actually at one point or another has sort of affected the whole country, should we be concerned about how well targeted aid to state and local governments is, or is that something we should be less worried about, compared to, for example, wanting action to be taken more quickly? Or
I'll offer a stab. And I think whenever Congress was first proposing the CARES Act, they weren't quite as concerned about targeting because they were just trying to get money out the door. But I oftentimes when I think about targeting, I often think about the politics of budgeting and who's the most important voter in Congress. And so I think to the extent targeting is happening is might reflect the political priorities of the people in the process. But maybe Mark has some deeper insight on this than I do.
I mean, I think you need to think about the things you do and don't want to do. You don't want to reward states that were irresponsible for the crisis, that took, saw a period of economic growth and spent all the money on new tax cuts or new spending increases, didn't build any rainy day fund. How about it? You don't want to reward them for that. But nor do you want to doubly punish them for that. You shouldn't say, well, because you were irresponsible, now you get no money. And I think you do need to consider losses. The state of Idaho is an example, essentially has is above their pre-pandemic revenue projections. They're actually doing better now than they were pre-pandemic, whereas other states are doing miserably. So that's tough because there's always this trade-off, with you don't want to kind of reward different kinds of behaviors, but you don't want to give money to states that don't really need it. That's why I like the idea of trying to peg to an unemployment rate or change in employment or things like that to the extent we can. If we can target some, that's great. I think we need to understand that some of this money is just, a lot of the CARES Act money was wasted, and even with a smarter bill, still some of the money is going to be wasted. Let's try to minimize the waste, but not pretend we can eliminate it. That's just not realistic.
Thanks. There's a question in the chat, and it first says, great analyses, thank you. So I'll add my thanks. Do either of you want to take a stab at any implications for local policymakers as to what they should do in light of any part of your analyses? And I guess, I would sort of add to that, we're going to have a couple of local practitioners this afternoon that are going to be getting into, what's kind of the effect, kind of at the micro level. But if you were sitting in a local government budget office right now, how should you be approaching, kind of preparing for the next couple years? Any sort of advice you could give on that?
Yeah, so there's a few things I mentioned in my presentation, and I'll try to highlight them again. So I'm optimistic about property tax revenues. I think it's looking like they're going to hold up pretty well. I think it's really important for local governments to try to get a handle on how many delinquent taxpayers they're expecting to have for the property tax. So if you're in an area that has a lot of people who are delinquent on their mortgages, I would expect those are the same people who are likely to be delinquent on their property taxes. And so that's how you can get a sense of what the impact is going to be on property tax revenues this year. I think it's also important to take steps to not basically seize the home of people who are unable to pay their property taxes this year, to maybe offer some kind of local forbearance program on property taxes is something to think about. Income tax revenues, I pointed out, so in Maryland, the county governments receive a pretty substantial part of their budgets from income tax revenues. I know that's the case in some other states. Income tax revenues have held up pretty well in Maryland, I think because of all the federal actions, as we've kind of hit on earlier, and because high wage earners are doing pretty well right now. If you're in a state that's pretty reliant on local option sales taxes, so Tennessee is one I'm thinking of. A lot of cities have pretty high local option sales taxes. I think those are the places that are going to be experiencing the most fiscal stress at the local level. And it's probably going to be that way for a while until things sort of go back to normal once we have widespread vaccine distribution. Mark said August. I've seen April, so I would plan for maybe August. Maybe Mark has a better sense of this, but it's definitely going to be in the second half of the year that things start to look more normal. In terms of other spending, again, I think it really is going to depend on whether Congress extends PUA in terms of what the strain is going to be on spending. And so that's something I would keep an eye out for. And it looks like Mark wants to add something, so I'll do that.
Well, I guess that in terms of August versus April, I think that it's kind of a question of what happens when, because the vaccine is going to be distributed little by little. I think that, again, maybe we get 30 million doses in December and 30 million a year after that. And then if Johnson & Johnson is successful with a single shot, or AstraZeneca, we can start ramping up quicker. I think spring is when we start to see cases really start to go down. But it's a long time between that and when enough of us are vaccinated that we feel like there's no more pandemic. And so that I think is more of a fall target of when we're kind of out of pandemic. But I agree. I think we got a bad winter, and as it starts to get warm, we'll have two things going for us at the same time. We'll be moving outdoors, and we'll be having higher and higher herd immunity, both sadly natural herd immunity and the vaccine herd immunity. So I don't think we really disagree. It's just kind of where you are in the timeline that you call it normal. I think normalcy starts in April, and we're there by August or September or whatever.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And one other thing I'll add is to the extent that money is available, I think supporting small business is probably the best way for local governments to target sort of their own local programs. So in Maryland, the Governor Hogan is actually providing $250 million in aid to small businesses. That's going to be paid for out of the Budget Stabilization Fund. My own local government here in Maryland, Hyattsville, is providing its own programs to support small businesses. A lot of local governments depend on sort of these Main Street restaurants and bars as sort of an economic revitalization program. And right now, those are the places being hit the hardest. So to the extent that a local government or state government is able to provide aid, and they want to sort of maintain the overall vitality of their local economy, I think that's probably the single best place to look. And there's a lot of different places that are trying different programs that might be worth kind of doing some research and checking out and seeing, maybe even writing those local governments to see how those programs are faring.
So there was a question that got asked sort of in advance of the presentation, and I'm going to read the question, but then I'm going to adjust it a little bit because I think Luke already focused on part of this in his presentation. The question was, how are fiscal conditions for local governments different now than they were after the 2008 recession? I mean, you talked very specifically about the property portion of this, and the fact that it's very different than it was after the 2008 recession. But are there other ways that this is sort of similar and different to the conditions that local governments faced after the 2008 recession?
I'll take a quick stab. I think the single biggest difference is that the Great Recession was a lot of different things in one. So it was banking crisis, and then it was a really severe economic downturn. And the research that's out there on economic downturns seem to suggest that banking crises have the longest recovery periods. I think we're actually going to see, once the vaccine is widely distributed, however long that takes, economic activity is going to snap back pretty quickly, unless something else happens along the way. And so I think as long as we can bridge this period, this second wave, and we can get to the other side of this next summer, that we should see a resumption of normalcy. It's not going to be like the Great Recession, where unemployment is going to be really high, and that's going to drag out for years and years and years. Although maybe Mark has a different take on this than me.
I agree with. I mean, it could drag up before full recovery, but I generally agree with the Great Recession. It was sort of a 1, 2, 3 punch. I mean, there was, the property tax loss happened in 2 waves. There's people that were kicked out of their homes that didn't pay, and then there was the revaluations that happened a couple of years, affected revenue a couple of years later. And meanwhile, underlying this whole thing is weak employment and a fear to spend. Those things, for the most part, aren't happening now. Other than and it's not really a fear to spend so much. It's really hard to spend money when you're locked in your home. So we're seeing some of that, but the other things aren't happening. So I generally agree that I expect a bigger recovery. I really worry about states that rely a lot on commercial property taxes, because I think commercial real estate is going to tank. Office buildings, restaurants and bars that are near office buildings, and stadium areas. So I do worry about some of that. But I think overall the outlook is, the medium-term outlook is better for states than during the Great Recession.
So there's another question in the chat. It says, if a municipality is in relatively good fiscal shape, where should they look to get the, quote, best bang for their buck in the upcoming year or two? Anyone have any thoughts?
I alluded about this earlier, but to the extent you can to the extent you value your Main Street businesses, your restaurants and your bars, and again, a lot of local governments use those as sort of an economic development tool to get people into their downtowns. To the extent you can provide aid to those places, I think that's probably the best way to use it. There's a lot of different programs out there. I mentioned one from the state of Maryland, from Governor Hogan. A lot of these programs, they look a lot like the Paycheck Protection Program the federal government launched. That basically was providing a subsidy to pay workers who were unable to work as a result of the pandemic. I think it's worthwhile to do some research on what different states and local governments are doing to support their Main Street businesses, and reach out to those places and ask whether they think the programs are working, ask whether the businesses are participating in those programs, see if they run out of money, see how, basically the subscription rate of them. In my view, that's one of the best ways to help these businesses bridge this until, again, we get back to normalcy sometime in the second half of 2021.
I mean, it's not an economic, near-term economic thing, but actually really is. We got to figure out the schools. If kids can't go to school, their parents can't go to work. And if their parents can't go to work, they can't earn money and pay taxes. And if you're looking 20 years in the future, the kids aren't in as good shape. So we got to figure out the schools. And speaking as a parent who has a school in his front yard right now, which is not the optimal way to do this, the solutions, I think, in effect for this semester are not working great.
So there's no more questions in the chat. I don't want to close without asking Mark a debt question. So first I want to say that I've been really impressed as somebody who's been watching the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget for a lot of years at how well the organization has pivoted in the last year toward the kinds of things that you've been doing in terms of sort of tracking the money. Because as you suggested, it was not the right time to be talking about how we ought to be reducing the debt. And one of the interesting things to me has been, I've been hearing for 30 years that one of the arguments against, sort of large federal debt is that it will, if we have a large federal debt, it will prevent us from responding to a crisis. Well, it doesn't seem to have prevented us from responding to this crisis. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about, if that's not true, or at least wasn't true this time, why should people be worried about a large federal debt? You suggested pretty strongly that there are, some things out there on the horizon that suggest that we should not be complacent. But if you were advising members of Congress, which you do sort of routinely, about when is the right time to start thinking about the debt again, and why should they care about it, what would you say?
Great. So let me kind of address that in two parts. One, this question of did it inhibit our current crisis response, and then secondly, what are the other consequences? Christina and David Romer, who are, I think, two of the top economists in the country, did sort of a pretty comprehensive study of countries around the world that have entered crises in periods of high debt or low debt, and found pretty consistently that high debt countries had more trouble responding to crises, and therefore had weaker recoveries than low debt countries. The United States is incredibly lucky. We are the strongest economy in the world. We are the world's reserve currency. We print in our own currency. And our Federal Reserve was willing to buy $2 trillion of our debt. By the way, no one is buying long-term US debt right now. The Federal Reserve has bought more than the US government has sold. And so we were economically able to spend for this crisis. But every time you raise the debt, you have less fiscal space. And we don't know where that limit is, but you have less in the future. And it's both an economic issue, but also a political issue. I think that one of the challenges with getting a second phase of relief, even though we all knew states and localities needed more aid, we all knew we didn't want the unemployment benefits to expire. One of the challenges was some people thought the debt was already too high. Now, I'm not saying that if we had come in with lower debt, it would have been easy peasy, but you can't dismiss that as a factor. So I do think even here, it has inhibited our political space some. But at some point, we've seen this around the world. At some point, debt will be high enough that as a practical matter, will inhibit our ability to respond to crises. But that's only one of many reasons to worry about debt. The Congressional Budget Office, which is like sort of the official scorekeeper and the official kind of analyst of the US government, they've looked at our current debt path, and they think that if the increase in debt between 2019 and 2050 is enough to slow economic growth by about 20 basis points a year. Now, over 1 year, 0.2%, no big deal. But every year, year over year, that adds up to a lot. That means that per person income will be about $7,000 per person lower per year in 2050 than it otherwise would be. It's kind of a slow, gradual effect. But the problem is the more people buy in government bonds, the less they're investing elsewhere in the private sector or in state and local infrastructure in ways that can actually grow the economy. So we have that growth effect, which is going to kind of accumulate gradually. And then we have the fact that more and more of our interest payments are going abroad. Essentially, more of our economic growth isn't enjoyed by Americans, it's enjoyed elsewhere. And meanwhile, this high debt, even at low interest rates, is going to accumulate to the point that by 2040 or so, interest will be the single largest federal government program. We're going to spend more on interest than we spend on Medicare, more than we spend on Social Security, more than we spend on defense. What kind of country spends more on financing its past than on spending in its present or investing in a future? Not any developed country I know. And lastly, while all the advantages the US accrues means that we will probably never default, and while we can probably bear a lot of debt, there's always the risk of a fiscal crisis, that we will essentially cause a financial crisis with our irresponsibility. At some point, if we keep borrowing and it's clear it's clear we have no plan to ever pay it back or service the debt, the markets could get a little panicky. And all they have to do is demand 2% more interest rates. And all of a sudden, the $14 trillion of outstanding debt around the world becomes less valuable. People sell it off. Banks go out of business. Whole areas go into recession. We have a global financial crisis caused by our inability to get our fiscal house in order. So yes, now is exactly the right time to borrow. Yes, we should actually be spending more, not less, over the next year. But no, this is not sustainable over the long run.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, we are out of time, and I really want to thank, this is the point at which if we were a room full of people, we would break into uproarious applause, but we cannot do that right now. But I want to express my appreciation to both Luke and Mark for really detailed presentations, a lot of sort of food for thought, and thank all of you who joined us today. And I wish you the best. And please, anyone who can come back this afternoon at 2 o'clock for a discussion from 2 local budget officials, one from the city of Omaha and one from Harford County, Maryland. So everyone have a good day till we see you again.